for me, the number one mistake I see more than anything, especially with people who don't have a lot of contract experience, is saying things multiple times. Saying things that are very similar, but saying them in different ways. So one of the first contracts I ever worked on as a new lawyer, the partner gave me this contract and said, "We want to terminate this contract." They were a franchisor. They wanted to terminate a franchisee. I was supposed to review the contract and advise. And so when I looked through the contract, I found 3 different places that talked about termination, and each one was worded differently. And I go to the partner and I'm like, "It says it 3 different ways. Which one's the right way?" And the answer was nobody knows.
How do you avoid common mistakes in commercial contract negotiation? What about in drafting? And how can you get better at and find more joy in commercial contracting? Today, we are joined on the Abstract by Laura Frederick, founder and CEO of How to Contract. She helps lawyers and professionals master real-world drafting and negotiation skills. She's also the host of ContractsCon, which is an annual in-person and virtual contract training extravaganza. I think that's my word, I don't know, in Las Vegas. Laura has more than 25 years of experience working on commercial contracts. This is really her passion. It's what she lives and breathes. She's worked on commercial legal teams at companies like Tesla and SolarCity, a variety of other companies in the renewable energy space. We'll talk about that today. And she started her career at Morrison & Foerster and K&L Gates, working on, you guessed it, technology transactions. Laura, welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I actually want to start today with a non-contracts related question. As I was looking at your background, I noticed that when you were at MoFo early in your career, you spent some time working in Asia, in Hong Kong and Singapore, like living there and working there. I guess, why did you want to practice in Asia? And tell us about that experience. That seems so cool.
It was the coolest. So by that point, I think, around a 4th-year lawyer. I was living in Austin. I loved Austin. I said I'd never leave Austin, but I wanted to go in-house, or I was actually looking for an in-house role in Austin. And I would get these recruiters, and none of them were great. This was in the 1999, and I was one of the few technology lawyers who had this kind of experience at this time. So anyways, suddenly a call came from a recruiter that said, "How about London?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." I didn't have any kids. My husband at the time was very flexible. Started talking, and it ended up being Morrison & Foerster. And through the conversations, I ended up getting an offer. But the plan was they wanted to send me to one of their foreign offices, but they first started at San Francisco. So I went to San Francisco, worked for 9 months, and then London wasn't the right fit. So they said, "How about Hong Kong?" And I said, "Sure." And so I went to Hong Kong. The craziest part was I went, when they sent me, I was already pregnant. I was due I went there right around New Year's Eve. Or we arrived New Year's Eve, and I ended up having a baby in May. And and I even said to MoFo, I was like, "You know what? It's okay. We can wait. I don't have to go right away." They were just the most amazing firm, and still are. They just said, no, we still need you there. So I moved to Hong Kong, had the baby in Hong Kong in May. And then after a year there, they said, "You know what? We really need someone with your skill set in Singapore." So they moved me down there. I worked there for about a year and a half, and then moved back to the San Francisco office. But it was just an amazing experience. I just really loved working overseas. I had been an exchange student in high school, done a semester abroad in college, and even a summer program in law school. So I've always had that interest in international, and it was really the opportunity of a lifetime, and has shaped a lot of how I how I live, just with a better connection to people around the world from having that experience.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure it also teaches you to think about doing business with different people from different places with totally different backgrounds, right? In a new way. I mean, I spend a lot of time working with folks in Asia, and I had a little bit of experience with Europe, and it teaches you to, I think, be a little more open minded and give people the benefit of the doubt, and question, like, the way that you've always done things may not be the right way in every circumstance.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think accepting, well, what I'd say is for me, it was also learning to appreciate that what they're bringing to the conversation instead of it
Yes.
just being about me. And so even in contracts, I have my way I want things done. If I'm negotiating with other U.S. lawyers, most of the time we're generally in the same area in terms of approach. But sometimes when I negotiate with counterparties overseas or get their form contracts, it's just such a different approach. And you're right. It's that open-mindedness and learning to appreciate different approaches.
So when in your career did you feel like you really started to work with contracts? And what do you think it was that drew you in to focus on that sort of practice area? Like, did you explore other areas first? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So my first job out of law school was with a franchise firm. I had come out of law school, as you can tell from me talking about the international experience. That was my passion. I was international economics undergrad. I wanted to do something international. The only job I could find out of law school that had anything international was a firm that had both U.S. and international franchise clients. So I did that for about 2 years before I moved to check transactions. Doing the franchise work, it was a combination of regulatory compliance, disclosures, and contracts. I hated the regulatory compliance. There were too many rules. They didn't make sense. They weren't intuitive. There was no creativity, or at least, to my young first year lawyer perspective, it didn't have that. But the contract side was just so challenging. I remember working on my first contract, and I had no clue. I thought, here I am. I'm, a graduate of college in a humanities major. I can write 50 pages, in a couple hours if needed. And here I was having so much trouble just constructing a simple sentence that could fit in a contract. And I loved that challenge. And then I also love the flexibility of it, that it's really a business document. It always has been. And when you're doing these commercial contracts, you're not aiming for perfection. You're aiming for a reasonable protection of risks. And if there's a typo here, typo there in your normal day-to-day contract, as long as it's not a big material, meaningful mistake, it's probably fine. And I always like that. I think it makes it more, I can enjoy it more when I'm not so stressed out all the time that I'm going to make one little mistake.
Sure.
So, and maybe that's, not the best thing to admit, but I just love the flexibility about it. I love how it's a business document. I love the strategy. I love the words, and learning how to write the language and speak the language of contracts, and then use that knowledge to help my clients and achieve their outcomes. So I just think they're the best.
Yeah, I mean, you strike me as someone who's very focused on, and not just because you're a founder, but very focused on business outcomes. And you understand, I think, oftentimes actually the not lawyers, the business development people or the product people that's a hugely important input, I think, to the contracting process, because they're the ones who are trying to drive some sort of business outcome, and the contract is the thing that makes it possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was one of the things I always did well with, which was talking with business teams, product team, engineers, quality teams, logistics teams, supply chain teams, because I talk like a regular person, or at least that's what I think of myself. And people have said that to me. I sound like an ordinary person. I've never had that kind of polished way of speaking. And I always saw that as a detriment, that, I wasn't as good as the other lawyers because I couldn't sound amazing on demand.
Right.
I was so intimidated by those lawyers who would just open their mouths and it would be beautiful language coming out. And here I am like, yeah, it's totally sucks, that we got to do this, but let's. So I have this informality about me that I had even when I was doing mega deals. But I think it works really well in terms of putting the business people at ease, putting my counterparties at ease. And I think sometimes, especially before people knew who I was, I could fly under the radar a little bit more because they'd hear me talk and think, oh, she's not too threatening. She's not going to get the better of us. And, I'd sneak in and do my deal.
Once upon a time, you were Tesla's secret weapon or something like that. I do want to talk about that. So you spent quite a bit of your career in the energy renewables space. How'd you get into that, and what's it like to work on contracts in that space?
Yeah, I fell into it. I had worked in law firms for about 9 years, some franchise in the beginning, then tech transactions, and worked on every single industry there was. It didn't, I think, really and everything. Whatever it was that came through the door, we worked on. And then when I wanted to go in-house, this was when I had a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old, and I was pregnant again. And I'm like, okay, I need a 9-to-5 job. I need a job where I can go home and not work. And the job I found, which was a little bit by accident, because I was looking more for the lifestyle than the exact industry. And it was this big energy diversified energy company out of Pennsylvania called PPL. And I was going to be in charge of supply chain. And I told people, I'm retiring, I'm just going to work 9 to 5. I'm getting out of the rat race. And ended up, I just loved it because I started and I was, as a 9th-year lawyer, we know everything. We're so smart. We've been there. I've been working in big law firms on mega deals over the worldwide deals for a long time. I thought I knew everything. And I get here and I had to really start from scratch because the way contracting works in the energy space is very, very different from how contracts work in other spaces because we had the regulatory overlay with the energy the state and federal level. Then we had, even back then, because this was in the mid 2000s, that we didn't have energy storage like we do now. So they sent me to an electricity 101 class when I first started that they put on for people who were new to this energy industry. And I had no idea at the time that energy couldn't be stored. Like, what? What are you doing?
You don't think of unless you're in space, right?
Yeah. And back then it was, energy wasn't as, it wasn't as much of a cutting edge field as it is now. It was just, you have utilities and they have generation with nuclear, coal or oil or whatever it is. So yeah, I got to learn everything about energy. And then the stuff I worked on was everything from naming rights to a soccer stadium that the company bought, to buying uranium for the nuclear plant, to trading derivatives through the 2008 bust with Lehman as counterparties and companies like that, doing these financial derivative contracts. So it was such a great experience to get so many different kinds of contracts. And I think it really propelled me forward in terms of my career, because once you touch every single kind of contract, we had propane company contracts. So once you do everything in that whole gamut, you see all the ways they kind of feed into each other, that concepts in one, like some of the ways I approached the financial derivative contracts and learned how those work really helped me do technology licensing contracts. And the propane company helped me do really, the 100 million master services agreements. So I think the experience of working in renewables I loved it for the diversity of subjects, the complexity, and really still love it. It's my favorite area.
What, as you're pointing out, right? Commercial contracting is an extremely sort of broad term and encompasses all sorts of different types of deals or transactions. what are your favorite types of deals to work on? What do you get most excited about?
I love really large equipment and manufacturing contracts. So I have my super niche, the thing, and
Uh-huh.
for a while I think I was in the top probably 10 to 20 lawyers in the country who did this kind of work, because when I was at SolarCity and then at Tesla, I was doing a lot of really, really big deals, and did a lot
Mhm.
even before that. I was at a solar module company called Hanwha Q Cells. And so it's buying the like solar modules, or buying all the equipment. You have a, $700 million renewable energy project getting built, and I'd be
Mhm.
the one buying all the equipment for that project.
Mhm.
And so I really, really love those, again, because it's the intricacy, the way those projects, the equipment works, and especially at that scale and dollar value, if you
Mhm.
a little mistake, has huge repercussions. So it was interesting. I had to understand, for example, a solar module starts to degrade as soon as you open the box. And so
Okay.
we had to be careful to tie our warranties to when the box was opened, not when they were delivered. Um, Things like
Interesting.
that, like lots of little nuances that once I learned the industry, I could apply those and help my client by using that knowledge to protect them. So, yeah, it's just a real fascinating area.
That's interesting. So, besides maybe being like super detail oriented, is there advice that you give folks on how to do deals like that and do it well, right? I mean, let's assume that I haven't been in the industry for 15 years, and so I haven't seen it over and over and over again. Just using that as an example, right? We don't have to. I'm just curious if there are like broader lessons for how
Yeah.
to contract in that way and do it really well.
Yeah. For me, I think it's what my advice that I give people is to really dive deep. Not,
Mhm.
you have to dive deep on the legal concepts. You have to understand warranty through and through. You have to understand how indemnities work through and through.
Mhm.
Not just the superficial level, how others are negotiating it with you, but really, really understand it. But that's only part of the picture. The other part of the picture is you really do have to understand the operational elements of what your contracts, how it works, or how the subject matter of your contract works. So for
Mhm.
me, whether it was solar module, energy storage, technical services, you know, I look on a piece of paper, oh, the, vendor will provide services. Well, what exactly? Oh, well, they're going to
Mhm.
go in and they're going to tweak this little screw. Okay, so what happens if that screw doesn't get tweaked? Do we have another screw sitting there? If they mess it up, can we go do that? How much would it cost to find somebody else to turn that screw? So your
Mhm.
brain has to be kind of on turbocharge, thinking about all the things that could go wrong, but you can't
Mhm.
do that unless you really, really, really understand the business and the technology and the operational elements of it. So that's what I always tell people to focus on. It's, you have to understand the law and the contracts, but where I see lawyers fall short is when they don't really get that operational insight.
Mhm.
And those are the lawyers that, they do a decent job, but they'll never be able to protect their client as well as those that really, really understand the operations.
So like really pull on the thread, basically. That's great advice. I mean, your passion for contracts is so evident. I guess I'm curious if there was ever a point in time during your career in house where you thought about doing like taking on a more generalist role, or if you were like, no, this is the thing that I love, and I want to just do this forever and always.
Yeah, it was kind of like that. It's at some point in my career, in my in-house career, I was, I always loved doing my supply chain work and my sales work. I love doing all the commercial stuff. And I thought, well, to advance, I need to become a general counsel. That's every lawyer's goal in life. An in-house
Mhm.
lawyer is to become a general counsel. And I
Mhm.
remember I went and interviewed for a couple roles, and I was being considered because I had this experience. And mostly I was looking for places where a lot of the job was going to be commercial contracts. And so I interviewed for one, and we started talking about the job. And they were saying, yeah, you'll be in charge of these corporate, some of our financial things, and we've got the HR things. And I remember I can even feel that moment of like, ew, why? I don't want to do that. Like, what? And that's what I realized, even though a lot of people dream of being a general counsel, it was not my dream. Like, why would I give up doing what I love every day, all day, basically, to doing what I love only a small part of the time? And so that's when I kind of said, you know what, I'm sticking with contracts. That's my path. That's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to keep learning, getting better, and just enjoy the fact that I'm one of the few who absolutely loves my job every day. Maybe there's conflict and there's issues in different jobs and things like that, but I don't think I've ever not loved working with contracts.
Yeah. I will say, I mean, I have a lot of people on, and you're now, especially as a founder, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. I mean, you are a generalist in some ways, right? I mean, you're right.
Well, not, I wouldn't, because I'm one of those lawyer founders. We're not really business people, or there are some, but I'm not really a business person. I'm still the lawyer. It's just I happen to have a business, but, I'm not very good at the business side of things. So.
What I was going to say is, I mean, I have a lot of guests on who are GCs or generalists, or have even gone on and like they decide, okay, I want to go even well beyond legal and be a COO or help run strategy. But I think that it also is important to highlight voices like yours that have specialized and in some way. And have found real sort of like happiness and meaning and enjoy that and know who you are, right? I mean, that's really the goal, is like know who you are and know what makes you tick, as opposed to try to drive towards anything that everyone says you should do.
Exactly.
Where do you think your passion for your very evident passion for commercial contracts comes from?
I think, I just indulge myself in it. It's so, I was always thought it was interesting, and I like the strategy, and I like the words, and I like the relationships with my clients, and the way that we're working with a counterparty to achieve a business outcome in a relationship. We're not there because we hate each other and we're trying to settle some dispute. So I love that part of it, that nobody's generally forced to do these deals, that the businesses are choosing to do these deals together. So it's a nicer environment generally when you're negotiating these kinds of contracts than those who are litigators or in the middle of other conflicts. So, but yeah, I think at the end, I'm really driven by service. I was raised in a family that was very service oriented, and I love helping my clients, whoever they are. And often they're people who want to do right by the company. They want to protect the company, get a great deal, but they might not have all the skill sets to do it. And so when I come in, I'm there to help them. And there's so much joy and fun in that. But I also get to play the games with the words, like, okay, if I tweak this word a little bit here, it's a little bit better for my client, even though in the grand scheme, it's so unlikely that that little tweak will make any difference whatsoever. But I get paid to play that little game of how do I tweak my words to make it better for my client, so if there ever is a problem, they'll be protected. So, I'm not quite sure where it came from, but from the beginning, I loved it. I actually talked to one of my mentors, was talking about when I was a young associate, and he said, sometimes I would be annoying to the other associates because I would be so focused on what the rules were and what we should say. And they're like, she's going on and on. But he said to me, but you were right. So, I have to be careful there not to be too annoying on this stuff. So I hopefully learned how not to be as annoying as I got older. But I think it's that fun of learning the rules inside out and then being able to use them for your advantage.
Let's talk about like some tips and tricks that you've picked up over the course of your career. just to start with, are there common mistakes that you see on the drafting side of commercial contracts?
Yeah. I think for me, the number one mistake I see more than anything, especially with people who don't have a lot of contract experience, is saying things multiple times, saying things that are very similar, but
Mm-hmm.
saying them in different ways. So one of the first contracts I ever worked on as a, new lawyer, the partner gave me this contract and said, "We want to terminate this contract." They were a franchisor. They wanted to terminate a
Mm-hmm.
franchisee. I was supposed to review the contract and advise. And so when I looked through the contract, I found 3 different places that talked about termination, and each one was worded differently.
Ah.
And I go to the partner and I'm like, it says it 3 different ways. Which one's the right way? And the answer was nobody knows. You go to the court, you make arguments, but basically now this franchisor didn't have any predictability about what it could do with a counterparty because
Mm-hmm.
it didn't know which of those applied. And it was such
Mm-hmm.
a great lesson. And I see it play out over and over because when in my role as commercial lawyer, I also was kind of the first person to deal with disagreements with the counterparty if
Mm-hmm.
there was a problem before anybody was filing lawsuits, way before all that, when we're just starting to work it out. And that was the most common problem we had was the language wasn't clear. And often it wasn't just being vague. It was saying similar things multiple times in different ways. And to me, that's
Yeah.
the worst thing you can do.
That's great advice, or the advice that comes out of that, which is say things in plain English and don't say them over and over because they may conflict with each other. I mean, that's fantastic. How about on the negotiating side? How do you coach people to negotiate more effectively?
Yeah. For me, it's really making sure you understand what your risks are. You have to start with a contract is a tool of risk management. And
Mm-hmm.
what you can't, if you just pick the approaches that some negotiation guru or contract guru says to do, focus on indemnity, focus on limits of liability. Yes, but the mistake I see people make is they're so overly focused on those, they
Mm-hmm.
totally miss the bigger risks that exist in other provisions. And they won't get the right intellectual property rights. They won't have clear payment terms. And those things are what really drive, indemnity is certainly in an extreme case is a big risk.
Mm-hmm.
But over my career, working 25 years, I very rarely saw indemnity come and play out. On
Mm-hmm.
a weekly basis, we had payment disputes, we had operational disputes, we had IP
Right.
disputes, and not huge IP infringement lawsuits, but like, wait, you're not supposed to be using that. Oh, wait a second, I own that, not you. So we had a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those things, they come up at the operational level. And those are so critical. So one of the things I always say to people is focus on your risks first. And
Mm-hmm.
then the second thing is really focus on how much bargaining power you have. I call it
Mm-hmm.
negotiation currency and treat it like you're on a
Yeah.
budget. So if you're the little guy and you're negotiating
Uh-huh.
against the big gorilla, you have a very tiny negotiation budget. You're not going to get much of anything. So you have to really carefully spend what leverage you have. And in
Mm-hmm.
advance of showing up at that negotiation, you're thinking about, okay, I'm only going to be able to get a couple things. What's most important? What am I going to fight for?
Mm-hmm.
Versus if you're the big gorilla, or, even if you're 2 big gorillas negotiating with each other, maybe you have even leverage. So then you're thinking,
Mm-hmm.
okay, these are the things I want the most that are most important. So I'm going to budget more for a limitation liability, payment terms, termination for convenience, thinking about what I need and kind of pre-planning how you're going to spend your leverage in that negotiation. So that's something I think we all should be doing. And again, it all ties back to that operational risk I was talking about before. And you can't assess risk in the operations unless you understand what goes wrong with this kind
Sure.
of business. So it all kind of ties back together.
I love that. I love that phrase about currency, negotiating currency. That's a great way to think about it. Here's a question for you. I mean, a lot of times in a contract negotiation, well, sometimes there's a log jam, right? Or there's an impasse, or and I'm sure that you've encountered this many dozens or hundreds or of times over the course of your career. Do you have like tips or ideas, strategies that you feel like work well for breaking that sort of log jam or getting to a better conclusion?
Yeah. So I would say the mistake I see people make is they try and push through it. They try and just use a ram and push as hard as they can and beat the other side down until they concede. And it creates antagonistic feelings. It creates resentment. It has a lot of negative repercussions when you're negotiating that hard to push through a logjam. So the techniques I prefer, if it depends on what the kind of deal it is and where you are in the deal. If you're still in kind of the middle of it, you're still getting through 50 different issues you're trying to negotiate in this contract, I always just put it to the side. If we don't agree on it quickly, I immediately move it to the side so we can focus on all the things we can agree on. And that way, let's say there's 50 issues when you started your negotiation. You hit a log jam on 5 of them, but you were able to work through all the other ones. Then you come back to that short list. And what happens, and I can tell you after looking back at my career with, I would guess, 10,000 plus contracts I've probably worked on, the end moment typically is a horse trade. Typically, each side is looking at what's left. The senior executives who are making the call are basically like, tell you what, I'll take these 2, you take those 3. It's sort of like they make that call because there's only 5 things left, and then they can make an assessment of what's most important for them at that moment. It doesn't always work out that way, but it often does. And by putting those really difficult issues aside, you're preserving goodwill, you're preserving momentum, you're making sure the parties who, again, this is the start of a long marriage together, you're making sure that they're going into it without creating that level of conflict that will have long-standing results. Because also I find with those log jams, if you push too hard during negotiations, it really does, and I've seen it even on my side of the deal, it can create people who just put up artificial walls and artificial barriers. So I've had that happen so many times where I'm working with a business person. We have the freedom to concede these things. And because the other side pushed so hard and were being jerks, my side doesn't. Even though they could easily give everything away and it wouldn't be a problem, they choose not to because the jerk's on the other side. So in this kind of commercial world I work in, that's an important part of it, is being, keeping it professional, keeping it nice. And if you try too hard to run through log jams, my experience is it always comes back to bite you.
Hey there, legal teams. Big news. SpotDraft's fall release is here, and it's our biggest update yet. With over 15 new features, it's packed with tools to make contracting faster and simpler for you. Want complete control over your workflows? You've got it with customizable approvals that actually fit your processes. Looking for clarity? Use SpotDraft's new analytics offering to uncover insights and find ways for your legal team to move faster. We've also made it easier to manage your agreements with the new Legal Hub, a straightforward way to publish and update terms online without waiting on IT or marketing. And here's the game changer. Our AI tools, like Verify, take on the boring stuff, contract reviews, and metadata extraction, so your team can focus on making decisions that matter. It's everything you need to manage your contracts your way. Check it out at spotdraft.com/fall-release. That's spotdraft.com/fall-release. Now let's get back to the podcast. And I mean, it will also sort of color the business relationship, as you're saying, on an ongoing basis, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you want the conclusion of the contract to be an exciting moment for both businesses, not okay, we got through that and now we hate each other and now we have to work together for many. I mean, I think most people see this and understand this when they're negotiating like their salaries in a new job. And I mean,
Exactly.
it's an easy corollary, I think, for people to understand there. Even though you've given us some rules, I mean, I do feel like negotiating is a little more art than science.
Hmm.
Are there a good lessons, or is there a great lesson that you picked up from a colleague or a mentor around negotiation during your career?
Yeah, I think the one I'd say, and I use this, and it's not exactly negotiation, but it relates, which is A level effort for A level work, C level effort for C level work. And that was something one of my mentors early on said, and it always stuck with me, especially for commercial contracts, because we deal with so much minutia and so many little 5,000, 10,000,
Mhm.
25,000 deals. And when you're negotiating those kind of deals, you have to remember what's important. And it
Mhm.
doesn't matter, you're not going to get all the provisions, and you shouldn't be spending all your time negotiating those. It just doesn't make sense from a risk management standpoint. So
Uh-huh.
keeping an eye on how important is the deal, whether you should even be worrying about it at all, whether even
Mhm.
lawyers should be looking at those deals at all, is something that it's something I learned early from my mentors and always applied. And again, especially in commercial contracts, more so I think than most other legal practice areas.
One of the things that I see now as a follow up to that point is uh, I talk to GCs who they've just decided for risk related reasons or for bandwidth reasons on their legal team, usually some combination of the two, that there may just be some contracts that they just don't negotiate. Like they full stop say, we don't negotiate NDAs. We'll sign anybody's paper. It's okay. It's just not this is not gonna create a problem for us. I'm curious what you think about that approach.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's fantastic in the right setting with the right person making that call.
Hmm.
And it has to be somebody who appreciates the risk of taking that approach.
Yeah.
And especially if it's an executive, a CEO, a general counsel who's making that call, that's a perfectly reasonable call to make. I think the thing that we watch out for, and as a lawyer, when I work with people who make that call, is we identify when does that rule not apply. So,
Sure.
for example, I have some clients who work with a lot of trade secrets. And for
Hmm.
them, the terms of the NDA are everything, because trade secrets are really only protected with counterparties if you have that NDA in place. And having a terrible NDA can jeopardize the value of the company. And
Yeah.
because their assets are their trade secrets. If that's the case, then we're going to take a very different approach. But that's only for technology and transactions that involve those trade secrets. If it's
Hmm.
just we're going to hire someone to water the plants, sign the NDA all day long, who cares? Same with the little services agreement. It's not really going to matter. But knowing when to apply those kind of rules and when not to. And I think it's perfectly fine for a lot of companies to have it across the board.
Hmm.
And I love the companies that just say we used, bond terms NDA. We use one
Yeah.
NDA or one a common paper, and I always just sign those unless there's something special about the deal. I think you can usually just sign those and be fine.
So you have all this contracting experience. Tell us the origin story of how to contract. How did you get started?
Yeah, I'd say it goes all the way back to when I was learning contracts. And it really was driven by anxiety and fear. Because when I was an associate and I'm, getting paid a bunch of money per hour by clients who expect me to know what I'm talking about, I was always trying to learn more. And whenever I
Hmm.
had good content, training, some checklists, some description, some good provision, I actually started my own personal playbook. I think I was a third year lawyer. And I would, over my career, would collect all those good insights that I could find. But throughout the career, I was looking for that good training, not the superficial, think like the business,
Yeah.
there's a lot of that. And even with contracts, most of the training was very nuanced or niche. So
Mhm.
this very narrow type of contract. So they'll have a CLE on a software license with AI, for example. That would be something
Mhm.
now. But where's the basic indemnification CLE? It just,
Right.
they wouldn't do that. So it was always frustrating for me. I really struggled to find training in the work that I did every day because I didn't want the niche stuff. I wanted the core stuff to make me better and better and learn new issues and get better at those things. So anyway, I go through my whole career looking and never finding. And later in my career, I've discovered I really love training, and the teams I worked with really, told me that I was very good at training. And
Mhm.
so after I launched my own law firm in 2019, I quit Tesla and put up
Uh-huh.
my shingle. And I'd been doing that for about a year and a half. And I thought, oh, I should start doing some training on the side. And
Mhm.
it kind of started when I started posting contract tips on LinkedIn, and people just had great feedback. They got involved in the conversation. And I thought, I should turn this into a business, and I should do training, and I'll do a membership, and I'll offer courses. And it all kind of started that way. It was almost like it wasn't the plan to begin with. But
Mhm.
then once I saw the need and how that same need I had grown up in my legal career with was
Mhm.
still there, and honestly, it is even today is still there,
Yeah.
that I was like, well, I'm at this point in my career, when I started a couple of years ago, I was 53 or so. I'm kind of reached my pinnacle. I'm kind of, have a lot to give back. And I
Mhm.
didn't want to just let all this knowledge kind of leave the profession with me.
Yeah.
So that was part of it too, was kind of collecting everything I knew while I knew it before I forget everything, and sharing it with the world in a way that would help people. So some was business, sure, and I'm all
Yeah.
about making money, but it really, a huge component of this and why I give away so much for free is because it's really just about helping people feel
Mhm.
better, be able to do their jobs better, and succeed in their life, without having to pay me something to make that happen.
Yeah. When you were leaving Tesla to before sort of how to contract came about and starting your solo firm, your solo practice, which you still have,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know. Was it scary to make that
Oh my
leap?
gosh.
Like, how'd you go for it?
Yeah, it was really one of the hardest things, one of the scariest things I've done.
Uh-huh.
Um, because at the time, in terms of context, so I was working at Tesla, I got my salary, I got my benefits, all that sort of stuff. I'm the sole, I've had my kids in sole custody of my kids with no contact with their dad since 2014. So at this
Oh
point, I'd
wow.
already had that for 5 years,
Uh-huh.
and I didn't have any family around. So it's just me taking care of my kids, and I'm the only one paying the bills. And
Hmm.
so I'm not married, or there's nothing like that. So all of a sudden I'm getting like, why would I leave this job where I have a salary, you
Yeah.
know? But what I came to, this was a point in my life where and I talk about mental health stuff a lot, and
Hmm.
that I had gone through a massive amount of therapy already. And I knew that, to trust myself, that
Uh-huh.
I could make those calls. And I also knew that I spent my career afraid of being fired on any given day.
Yeah.
And that idea that a job is safety is really, in a lot of ways, false for many people. It's, you're safe
Hmm.
only as long as they want to keep you around. Um, and by learning how to make money through
Hmm.
my own firm, I would actually be much safer. So I came up with a game plan. I said, I think at the time I had 8 months of saving in the bank, other than my retirement account. And I
Uh-huh.
said, you know what? If I hit 5 months and I'm not making money, I'll just go find another job.
Yeah.
I'll call one of the placement firms and I'll just get placed. But pretty quickly, I saw that I could make at least as much as I made when I was at Tesla and cover all my
Hmm.
bills, no problem. And then over the course of the next year or so, really learned how to sell my services, price my services, find clients, do all that kind of stuff. And I
Hmm.
realized like now I'm really secure because I don't just
Yeah.
have one company that's paying my bills. I have lots of different companies. If one goes away, I can go find another. And there's
Mhm.
so much security and power in that feeling that, you're really not dependent on any one company wanting to hire you and keep you employed.
And now you have this amazing feedback loop almost with your how to contract business as well. Talk about an amazing business development tool at your disposal.
Yeah. Well, I'll say when I started, because I have, the benefit of opening my law practice after I'd been, practicing. I think at that point it was 21 years. I forgot how many years I was back in 2019. So yeah, 23 years or so. I'd already practiced
Mhm.
law. And so I knew everybody and they knew me from all my in-house jobs and my law firm jobs.
Mhm.
So I had a pretty good, collection of contacts that I could reach out for and who would give me work. So I think I looked at it later on. The first 18 months of my law firm, it was like 97% of the clients I got were either former coworkers or former coworkers who referred somebody else to me. And then
Yeah.
once I started posting on LinkedIn every day, the 18 months that followed, it was the opposite. It was like 95% of my new clients were from my posts online.
Wow.
And I had so much work. I actually ended up I had 4 contractor attorneys working with me at one point
Really?
that
Oh,
year.
wow.
It grew so fast because there's something about posting every day online and
Uh-huh.
connecting with people every day on LinkedIn, especially then during the pandemic, that it just, and showing that I knew what I was talking about when it came to contracts. I think that just powered that familiarity people had with me and their comfort in sending me their contract work.
That's great, Laura. Before we wrap up, I didn't know you were going to mention it, but you mentioned mental health, and I think that is an area that folks in legal and legal adjacent roles. I think it's something that we need to focus on more. And so I just want to give you the opportunity, if you have any advice that you'd like to share with the audience. I would certainly love to hear it too.
Yeah, it's an area that's so important to me. And I didn't, I tell people I got my first therapist at 42. I
Uh-huh.
didn't realize that I could change some of the ways that I approached, some of the ways that I processed and dealt with life. And I
Mhm.
didn't realize what a positive impact going through therapy would have on every aspect of my life. And
Mhm.
so before I started with therapy, I very much felt like the victim. I felt like my life had turned into this place and I'd reached this point and it wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything to make it happen, at least
Mhm.
when it came to my personal life. My professional life, I felt in control. I have chosen these jobs. I've chosen this path. This is what I want to do. I'm where I deserve to be. But on
Yeah.
the personal side, it was like, oh, it's happening to me. I'm the victim. I don't know how to get out of this. And I didn't see how I had created all the circumstances. I had created the situation where I found myself in a failing marriage and just being unhappy and really
Mhm.
unable to cope with the difficulties of life. And it was through therapy that I found how my thinking contributed to that. And that I wasn't seeing the role that I had. For example, the idea of owning your outcomes and owning where you are in life, and that none of
Mhm.
us are victim. We're all making choices about where to be in life. And even though we feel like we can't make a different choice, we are making a choice even when we're not making that choice. You're choosing to
Mhm.
stay in your circumstances. And I think the other big thing, which I think lawyers really struggle with, and I did as well, which was this idea of I can control the world around me if I just do enough work and I tell people what to do and I set everything up so it won't fail,
Mhm.
then it'll all be good. And anytime things go wrong, it's because I didn't prepare properly. I
Mhm.
didn't, do these things. And I had this sense like I knew what was best for everything that was going on in my world, the people around
Mhm.
me, all that kind of stuff. And I had this great therapist who said, she's like, who are you, God? How do you know what's best for these
Yeah.
people in your life? You have no idea. Maybe you are exactly the thing that's causing all the problems in your life. And if you would let go of you're trying to control everything, then these other people would be better off. And I
Mm-hmm.
just was like floored by that because it really challenged the sense of me trying to control everything. And it goes back, there's a great quote on it, that you didn't have control. I forgot, I don't remember the exact wording, but essentially
Yeah.
it's you never had control, you only had anxiety.
Hmm.
And that false sense of control, especially lawyers and people in the legal world, create for ourselves because we're overachiever types and we're used to making things happen and we're used to being the smart one in the room and telling everybody what to do. So it's hard to kind of take that version of ourselves that doesn't know what's going on and
Hmm.
isn't in control and is just, you know, all we can control is ourselves. So I think embracing that, and again, my number one career advice for everyone is get therapy early and often. It will, my career, like the joy in my career, my ability to do a great job
Hmm.
went through the roof once I got my therapy. I learned how to
Hmm.
manage my emotions so much better. I learned how to really, embrace the role as opposed to, being scared all the time, being worried and stressed all the time. I found so much more peace once I went through my therapy. So I can't talk about it enough.
I would second that. Well, like a lot of what you said there really resonates, and I'm sure it resonates with people who are listening too. I mean, I've seen a therapist a few times in my life, and I started seeing a new one earlier this year, and it's been really productive. And I've noticed, not just in my personal life, but just in my whole life broadly, including my professional life, things are better as a result of the sort of guidance and sounding board that I have. So I think that a lot of people maybe struggle with the first step, which is like going and finding the therapist or asking
Yeah.
for help or telling their partner or their family that they want to go see a therapist, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit, it's almost like it's selfish. Especially when you have a spouse, you have children, you have a
Yeah.
job, you don't have free time to go see a therapist. Like in a million years, I wouldn't have been open to it as an associate in big law, even before I had kids, because I was working 60, 70 hours a week. When am I supposed
Mhm.
to see a therapist? But what I realized is, I should have skipped lunch some days to see the
Yeah.
therapist. I should have, not slept in one day to see the therapist. Like you can find that hour a
Hmm.
week. You can. And this idea that you're too busy, it's because you're on this mouse wheel and you're trying
Yeah.
to keep the mouse wheel going. But there's another way. You can actually, if with the therapist, you can figure out how to step off the mouse wheel and,
Hmm.
really create a life that you want for yourself and not just keep running as fast as you can.
I would say if this topic is interesting to like to someone who's out there who's listening, I did another episode with Jasmine Singh, who is the GC at a company called Binti, and she talked a lot about how earlier in her career she actually quit big law and became a spin instructor and had no plans to go back. And eventually she found her way back to the law in a much happier way.
Yeah.
But I think that this is a topic that isn't talked about enough. I'm glad that you brought it up. I would encourage folks to listen to that episode as well. Okay, Laura, if folks want to learn more about all that you do, about how to contract, they want to attend Contracts Con, where can they go to find out?
Yeah. The best place is go to howtocontract.com. That's my main website. And you can learn a lot there. For ContractsCon, it's contractscon.com. But the easiest way to find me is really on LinkedIn. I still post a contract tip every weekday and do a lot of other posting as well. So that's the best way. And encourage people who want to come to ContractsCon. I say, I do call it the extravaganza because we are the only legal conference legal conference, I think, where the speakers wear costumes. I don't think there's
Extravaganza
anybody
was your
else.
word then. I didn't know if that was in my script or if that was your word. That was your word.
Yeah, that's my word because that's what it is. Like we didn't when I had the idea of Contracts Con, it was really a celebration of contracts and not
Uh-huh.
just sitting around playing banjos, woo woo, but really just for people who love contracts. So one of my favorite quotes is one of the people who attended in the past. She said, "I've never been in a room where everyone was as excited to talk about indemnification as I was." And it's so true. Like the nerd level at Contracts Con is off the chart with between the speakers in their costumes and then the people who kind of self choose to attend. So those
Mm-hmm.
know-it-alls, those kind of the jerk lawyers, they're never going to go to something like this.
Right.
And so it tends to be people at all levels. We really focus on advanced training, but
Mm-hmm.
newer lawyers are welcome. We have a lot of contract professionals come, and it's really just indulging in, you know, day-to-day contract training on the core stuff we do all the time. So I hope people will come. You can join virtually or in person, but the in-person experience can't be matched. It's just a whole different vibe.
An extravaganza for contracts nerds.
Exactly. Where we find our place, you know. A lot of us don't necessarily feel at home in I don't know, a lot of the legal conferences. I always had this issue where you walk in and people immediately look at your badge to see if you're worth talking to, or, you know, everyone's talking to each other. They seem like they know everybody and you don't know anybody, and it's so awkward. And so a lot of what I do with Contracts Con is devised to create connections. So we do everybody sits at a small table and a different day one, day two. They have practice exercises they work on together at that small table. And then day two, we switch them around to different tables so that they
Oh,
get
I
to
love
meet
that.
more people. And it's very egalitarian. So we have partners in big law sitting with contract managers from a small company, and everybody's working on the same problem together and helping each other. And, you know, it's just a very collaborative place and very supportive of different people.
That's fantastic. I've got a couple of fun questions for you now as we
Sure.
start to wrap up. I think they're fun. The first one is what your favorite part of your day to day is.
You know, I'll say these days it's creating graphics. I had no idea that I would enjoy graphic design so much. Like even actually before today, because I own my business, I do all my own graphic design. And on my website, I create all the banners, I do all that stuff. Honestly, I could even leave the contract training aside and just create graphic design, but not for money or people telling me what to do. I'd have to do it for myself, but I just really love that. It's very the artistry of it. And I'm not a drawer or a painter, but there's something about being able to pull together elements and make them look beautiful, relatively speaking, in a graphic design way that I really enjoy.
That's great. That's different than anything that I've heard on the pod before. I love that. My last question for you, Laura, sort of traditional closing question. It's if you could look back on your days, maybe it was at the law firm as a young lawyer just getting started, something that you know now that you wish that you'd known back then.
Yeah, I think there's more than one way that life can turn that will make it wonderful. That I think is for me, like a lot of kind of overachiever lawyer types, you know, I have to get the best grade so I can get into the best college. I have to get the best college grades so I can get in the best law school. I have to get the best grades, get the best job. I have to get the best promotion, the best title, the best company so I can advance. And we're on this kind of narrow path that we think is success. And one of the biggest things I learned is the things that happened to me that were terrible at the moment were actually fantastic. And they contributed to the quality of my life in enormous ways that I never would have expected. So I think accepting you really don't know what's best kind of ties back to that advice in your career. And if I had just kind of been okay letting things fall into place. That doesn't mean abandoning my effort. It doesn't mean directing my career in a particular way, but letting things happen a little bit more as they happen without the stress over them happening. I think I would have had a lot more joy instead of the kind of the anxiety and the stress that seemed to dominate most of my career.
Well, you've certainly brought a lot of passion and joy to our conversation. This has been really fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Laura.
Oh, I had a great time. Thanks for having me. And I really, as you can tell, I'll talk contracts anytime.
We'll have you back. And to all of our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of The Abstract. And we hope to see you next time.